5 years of work has gone into this. This is Sticks and Stones, my debut crime novel. This is a crime thriller. It's set in Melbourne and it follows my lead detective, Emmett Corbin. And when we meet Emmett, he's just taken over a position as head of the missing persons unit. And when we meet him, we find that he's really feeling a bit unimpressed with the role that he's taking on. He feels like the unit is under-resourced and understaffed, and he's left swamped with these really banal cases, which he thinks that local stations should be investigating themselves. But then he comes across this case of a missing mum, and this is when everything really changes for Emmett. He quickly discovers that this mum left her 2 children at a holiday program and never returned to pick them up. So immediately it does look really quite suspicious. He gets very involved in this case and does a bit of digging. And initially everyone who talks about this missing mum says she's this really devoted, loving mum. She's part of this tight-knit family and that she would never ever leave her 2 children. But it doesn't take long before Emmett quickly realizes that this mum has been keeping some pretty big secrets, as in fact has her entire family. And so suddenly we see Emmett go from one end of the spectrum to the other, from feeling quite bored and quite unimpressed with the role that he's taken on to being completely run off his feet with this really complicated investigation, which effectively sees him chase an extremely dangerous predator through the streets of Melbourne. Now, as Fiona mentioned there at the top, I am a reporter. I've been a reporter for about 13 years. That's a bit of time that has snuck up on me. I think on the press release it said I've been working in the media for 10 years, but someone corrected me the other day on one of these events, and they are right. It's been 13 years. And so this book is largely influenced by many of the criminal cases and the court trials that I have covered. I, in fact, started out writing for the Herald Sun in Victoria. And when I started, I really wanted to be a sports reporter. And I had this huge passion for sport, and I just desperately wanted to follow that as a career. And it was around, I must have been around 2008, 2009, when Carr Williams died. He was, of course, a notorious underworld figure. And this was a time when Melbourne really was in the grips of a crime wave and an organised crime wave. And of course, Carl Williams was a bit of a kingpin in all this sort of situation. And my editor at the time sort of called me off sport and asked me to help covering the death and then the funeral of Carl Williams. And I was really dragged into this almost kicking and screaming. I really did not want to be involved in crime, I thought. I didn't want to get involved in breaking crime. And certainly not the underworld, which I felt like was a bit grubby and a bit sort of just not something that I wanted to get involved with. But I have to say, pretty much as soon as I started to get a bit of a sneak into this other world that's going on, I became absolutely intrigued and fascinated by these extraordinary crimes, which often are going on right in front of our faces as a part of daily life that we don't even know exists. And I will never forget covering the funeral of Carl Williams. It was one of the most surreal experiences, and I still feel like it was yesterday. It was held in this tiny little church in Essendon, which is a very sort of wholesome suburban area within Melbourne. And it was this beautiful little church, and there were purple flowers and balloons everywhere. And on one side of the aisle, you had this really notorious, quite dangerous underworld figures there to pay their last respects. And on the other side of the aisle, we had friends, family, neighbours, people from the local footy club who just thought he was a great guy. And so there was this real juxtaposition that I was really fascinated by. For the people who saw him as just a really average suburban guy, and then these other people who saw him as this kingpin and this sort of effectively hitman. And it made me start to wonder, how does someone get to that point where they can be running this sort of organization or this empire, and at the same time, they're still interacting with all the rest of us normal people day to day, going to the shops, picking the kids up from footy training, chatting to people at the local school. For me, it was just this extraordinary difference between what we largely consider to be a bad person and what other people consider to be a very normal, average person. And so from there, I actually requested voluntarily to move myself more into crime and court reporting because I became so fascinated by this little sneak behind the curtain that I had got. And I obviously started to cover a lot more of that underworld crime that was really taking over Melbourne at the time. But then there was a case that really struck me that was quite separate, and this was in 2014. And this really started to become the evolution of Sticks and Stones for me. And this was something I still consider to be one of the worst murders that Melbourne has ever experienced. And I don't believe it ever got the publicity or the attention that it really deserved. And this was the murder of Renee Lau back in 2014. Now, Renee was a pastry chef who had come over from Hong Kong to live and work in Melbourne. And by all accounts, she was living her dream life over here. She was volunteering at a local aged care facility. She was singing at a local choir. She had just met a guy, this boyfriend that she described to her family back home in Hong Kong as just being this terrific guy, and they were going to move in together. And everything seemed to be going fabulously for her. And then one day she was walking to work quite early in the morning along St Kilda Road when a man quite literally grabbed her, dragged her off the street and pulled her into the King's Domain around the Royal Botanic Gardens. And the attack on her was horrendously brutal. It lasted for over 80 minutes. He brutally raped and murdered her, and she was conscious for most of this 80 minutes. And sitting in court and hearing the details of what this man did to her, it's still some of the most harrowing testimony that I've ever sat through as a journalist. And for me, what was most striking was the fact that I was sitting in this courtroom looking at this man who was perhaps meters away. You know, you could sort of reach out and touch him. And he was completely disinterested. He spent most of his time through this case yawning. Her family were there, of course, absolutely hysterical, as you would be, hearing everything that this man had done to their loved one. And he was yawning, he was looking around the room. He was completely lucid and he knew what he had done, but he genuinely did not care. And for me, this was such a fascinating insight into the mind of a killer. And I started to think, well, how on earth did this man get to this point where he could inflict so much brutality on someone and feel so little, if anything at all? And what was extraordinary about this case was that it was so brutal, it was completely random, and there was no apparent motive. And the other thing which really shocked prosecutors at the time was that this man, Scott Allen Miller, had almost no history of prior offending. That's extremely rare in a case like this, something so brutal. Almost always you see a build-up of crimes before someone hits this point where they are so violent and so brutal. And at the time, when he was questioned about it, Scott Allen Miller said he didn't know why he'd done it. He felt like he just suddenly snapped. And that was in his own words. He just exploded into this rage. And so for me, I started to think, well, if he's had no history of prior offending, if he gave no signs of ever feeling this sort of way, what did get him to this point? And that's when I started to look back through his history and his childhood. And once I did, I could see that this was a person who had come from really quite an unstable background. They had been moved around a lot as a child. You could certainly say they had been let down by adults in their lives. And there had been that cycle of neglect and abuse. And this is something that I have really made a central theme in Sticks and Stones, this idea of damage in the past, creating damage in the future. It's something that you see when you sit in court time and time again, is that damaged child that grows up, falls in the wrong crowd, goes on to perhaps abuse their life partner or get involved in some sort of crime. And it's a cycle that repeats itself over and over and over. Almost always 9 times out of 10, when you hear about the offender's backstory, there has been some history of abuse. And that's for both males and females. And I find it really fascinating how much that damage in the past will create damage in the future. It's a cycle that seems extremely hard to break and to stop. And of course, in the real world, if we could, this would be the answer, I think, to reducing the crime rate significantly. So this is something that really is a central theme in Sticks and Stones. And so when I approached my story, I didn't want it just to be all about the crime. I wanted people to have the chance to see the backstory of my killer. And I've done this by using quite a number of flashbacks so that you do see a young child growing up and you see this little boy who, by all accounts, is a pretty good kid and has a lot of positives going for him. But he is consistently let down by the adults in his life. He has a very unstable upbringing. There's definite neglect and abuse. And we see him time and time again almost get back on track and unfortunately then just fall through the gaps. And for me, that is an important storyline. And I'm really fascinated to hear what readers will think at the end of my book, how they will feel about this killer, because of course he does go on to be a monster in effect, and he does some terrible things. And it's a difficult conversation to have because you don't want to look like you are sympathizing with offenders or condoning their behavior. And of course, in the case of Renee Lau, I mean, there's no way anyone could condone that behavior or sympathize. But I do think it's an interesting thing to look back and consider, how did that person get to this point? The other thing that I've done is I have told this story from multiple perspectives. So there are a lot of characters who contribute their own points of view to this story. A lot of feedback I've been getting so far is that it does read a little bit like a crime TV series that you might see on Netflix or something, because there are a lot of scene changes and it is all told from different characters' perspectives. The reason I did this, again, is because I think one of the things I'm so lucky, having been a reporter, is that I have been out on the road for 13 years and you do get to meet so many different people from all different walks of life. And one thing you learn very quickly is that crime doesn't discriminate. One day you can be in a courtroom with someone who might be at the peak of their career and have had everything going for them and have been from a loving family. The next, you're there with someone who's been through the court system their entire life and never really had a chance. And it's this idea of, crime does affect everyone. And so in my novel, you see how crime is sort of the central focal point, and you have all these other narrative lines going through this book, almost like sliding doors, where they all sort of intersect through how this crime happens. It's a little bit of a challenging way to write the novel because, of course, when you are constantly changing scenes and changing perspective, you do run the risk perhaps of confusing readers. So it did take me quite a few rewrites to make sure that I was introducing characters slowly enough that everyone would know what was going on. And of course, I had to make sure that my characters were distinct enough that you immediately know who I'm talking about when we do shift scenes. But so far, the feedback has been extremely good. I'm extremely excited that so far, most of the reviews, this book came out on Tuesday, so it's been out for about a week. Most of the reviews have really picked up on the themes that were extremely important to me to get across. So of course, I'm hoping that, anyone watching this will get a chance to pick this up either from the library or from your local bookstore and have a read. And certainly I would love to get, feedback on what people are thinking about it. As much as it does touch on some pretty intense themes, overall it is a quite fast read. It's quite light. I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not gory. It's not too violent. There's a lot going on. So I think even if you're not an avid crime reader, I think you will enjoy it. The other issue that I keep getting asked about, which is quite an intense topic, but it certainly is something that is covered in my book, is the issue of violence against women. And I think there's no doubt that Australia does have an epidemic of violence against women. You only need to sit in court for one day and you see the next case and the next case and the next case all affecting women in some way. That's not to say that we don't have hugely violent female offenders, because of course we do. And that's not to say that men are not often victims of crime, because of course they are. But this book does specifically have women as victims in the book when it comes to the particular crime. And it wasn't something that I consciously set out to do when I started writing, but unfortunately, because it is so prevalent at the moment, it was something that seemed quite believable and quite realistic, because tragically, quite often women do end up the victims of these sorts of crimes. I think women are vulnerable in society for a number of reasons, and I won't obviously go through all of those, but particularly when you're looking at people who have had traumatized pasts and they have grown up as children who perhaps felt like they were powerless and hopeless and had no real control over their life. Quite often, if they don't get the support and help that they need, they can turn into teenagers and adults who really lash out at society and try to create a sense of control and power over other people. And it's obviously misplaced control and power, but they do tend to lash out and try to feel that sense of control. And unfortunately, quite often it is women who bear the brunt of that sort of offending. So that is an aspect of the book. But again, it's not too heavy. It's more a passing theme. I really do think the central theme is this idea of how all our lives can intersect. None of us act alone or in isolation, and especially that idea of damage in the past going on to create damage in the future. One other thing I will say, because I am often asked this question, is how research heavy my book was. And the answer to that is it was surprisingly research heavy, given it is a fiction novel and it is not directly based on any one crime, even though I have taken inspiration from particular cases, as I mentioned at the start. Being a reporter, I was perhaps a bit naive or even a bit arrogant, thinking that I deal with police every day. I'm at crime scenes every day. I know how they work. I'll know how they operate. And it didn't take me long as I started to write to realize that I really didn't know enough to make this book what I wanted it to be, which was to be a truly believable, realistic police procedural crime thriller. It's really important to me that people reading this will think this actually could have happened. And certainly that is the end result. But for me to get to that point, I did need a lot of assistance. And it did take a lot of time for me to find people within Victoria Police who were willing and able to help me. I approached a lot of police. Even literally, I'd just walk up to people on the street and ask them, police officers, how would you do this? What would you do in this situation? How would you handle this? Eventually, I found a former detective out of Melbourne who had covered some of Victoria's biggest cases and had only recently retired. And that was a perfect fit because he's no longer working in the police force. He felt quite comfortable giving me bits of information. And he ended up being a wonderful resource for me. And we just email back and forwards whenever I would get to a point and go, I really don't know what detectives would do now, or would they do this, or how could I get them to this point? He was wonderful and so generous with his time to sort of give me all this insight. And I also found a police officer who had actually worked around the area where a lot of my book is set, around Docklands and Flemington in Melbourne. And she has some fabulous advice for me as far as the real boots on the ground, day-to-day sort of police reporting. And they are quite prominently mentioned in the acknowledgements at the back of the book, because I really don't think I could have done this book and given it this sort of credibility without their assistance. So certainly that's something I'm quite proud of at the end of this, that although it is fiction, it is a fairly intensely researched police procedural, and I hope that's something that will come across. Feel free to jump in if we've got questions. I'm more than happy to answer them.
Yeah, we've got a question from Wolfgang. He asks, were you worried that telling a book from multiple perspectives makes it hard for readers to follow?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I sort of touched on it earlier. It does feel a little bit like you have a jigsaw puzzle and you have all the pieces everywhere. And if you just hand everyone all the pieces right at the top, of course, they're going to be absolutely confused, and it is going to feel almost a bit jumpy as you get going. So this was something I was painfully aware of. In fact, when I read my first draft, I was a bit horrified, because it's always a bad sign when even the author no longer knows what's going on. And I was even confusing myself. There was so many scene changes and my timeline was all over the place, and I'd be reading it going, hang on, isn't it Wednesday? Why is this person over here? It was a real mess after my first draft. And the biggest learning curve I had through this was that although I have all these ideas running through my head and I have all these characters, I really did have to drip feed them into the story so that people first become invested in the first 3 or 4 characters, and then we can add a few more, and then we can add a few more. I guess it's a little bit like cooking. You can't just chuck all the ingredients in at once, but the timing and the way that you do that is quite tricky. And it did take me a lot of work to make sure it read smoothly and not to have that jumpy cut feeling. Because it's something that you maybe can do with a TV series, is you can have really short, sharp changes. With a book, you do need to let things breathe a little bit more. And it's a really good question that this person asked, because it's something that probably slowed down my writing process more than anything else. Was the style I've chosen is quite a difficult style to write, and I think it's quite a difficult style to get right. And in the end, I had to do 7 full rewrites before I was at a point where I thought, okay, I think I've got the balance right between fast and exciting, and everyone can still follow along what's happening.
Okay. Wolfgang's, he had another question as well. I'm just trying to find it. Sorry, it's disappeared. You might have actually answered it previously when you were talking. But hold on, I'll just find it. If you. He wants to know if you can talk a little about your experience finding a publisher, and did you use an agent?
Yeah, that's another good question. I'm sure a lot of people who watch this will be interested in the actual writing process and perhaps are looking at doing something similar themselves. And certainly when you are starting out, I mean, I found it completely overwhelming. So don't feel bad if you're in the same sort of stage where I was a year or so ago, and you have a manuscript and you're really not quite sure what to do with it. It really is quite a daunting process when you get to that point. And it can feel really difficult to navigate the publishing process. I quickly realized that I didn't want to just send my manuscript out to anyone and hope for the best. You know, they have these things called slush piles where they accept submissions from anyone, and then perhaps someone quite junior in the organisation might look through them and, you know, might select your manuscript for someone further up the chain to look at. I quickly decided I didn't want to do that. Also because once I'd done that 7th rewrite, I really didn't know if what I had done was good enough to be published. And so I felt like what I needed more than anything was a bit of feedback from someone within the industry. So I took a much more targeted approach and started looking for who can I sit down with one-on-one and get a little bit of help in actually looking at what I've done, and is this good enough? And if it's not good enough, what can I do? And if it is good enough, what do I do with it? And so I found a program through the Faber Writing Academy where you could have 15 minutes with a literary agent, and they would look at your first 3 chapters of your manuscript, and then they would give you feedback on whether it was ready to publish. It did cost a bit of money, but again, I was at that point where I felt like I was either going to pay for an editor or get some assistance. So I was prepared to invest a little bit of money in this. And so I went along to this meeting and had 15 minutes with the agent, Jacinta Demaze. And I truly went there with no expectations other than just to get some advice. And I still remember when I walked in and she opened up the notebook where my name was, and the page was absolutely blank. Like there was no notes or comments or anything. And I remember sort of my heart sinking, thinking, oh my gosh, did I not read the brief? Am I outside the sort of genre that she reads? have I done something wrong? Why do I have no feedback? And she actually ended up saying, oh, yours was the one I don't really have any comments for. I just would like to see the whole manuscript, please. And so I went home that night and pretty much sent her my entire manuscript on the spot. And she wrote back and basically offered to sign me up almost immediately, which was well beyond what I was expecting out of that meeting. And it did give me that confidence that, okay, I have rewritten this to a point where it is close to good enough to get published. She then had a few more suggestions for me to sort of fix the manuscript up a bit more, which I did. And then she sent it out on a wide submission base to a range of all the major publishers. And that was when things got really quite confusing for me. And I was so glad I had an agent doing that part for me, because the feedback from publishers was so contradictory and so all over the place. I think if I had been trying to navigate that myself, it would have been quite confusing. You know, I had one publisher say, I love it, but I'd like to make it a bit lighter. I think it's too dark. I had another publisher saying it's great, but we want to make it darker and more twisty. And it was just, everyone was telling me almost completely opposite things. And thankfully I had an agent to get me through that process. And I ended up with a publisher, with Penguin, with Beverly at Penguin, who I could not ask for a better fit for me, because she was more along the lines of giving me a bit of tough love. She was quite critical actually of my manuscript initially, but she really wanted to work with me on it. And that was something that appealed to me, because I really do believe you only get one shot at your debut. So you do want to get whatever help you can to make it absolutely the best it can be at the end. So it's a very long answer to your question, but I would highly recommend, if this is your first that you're trying to get in the door, that you try to get one-on-one feedback with somebody. That could be an agent, a publisher, an editor. Sometimes even these publishing houses use freelance editors to look at bits of your work, and they might be someone that you can actually find online and get them to help you. It may cost a little bit of money, but I think if you're at that stage where you're ready to submit, it is worth getting that bit of feedback.
Yeah, Wolfgang said thank you. There was another question about when the library's going to get your book. We did actually try to purchase it, but there was a delay in publishing. So we will be getting it this week, and we'll go through some processes. So it should be on our shelves fairly soon. Robin also commented that she can't wait to read it. So
good. Thank you, Robin. Yes, well, when you do get to read it, I would love to hear what you think of it. And I am on all the main social media channels, so Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Feel free to send me a message, because it's really exciting for me to hear what people think. And it's been really exciting to hear what people get out of it at the end, because everyone takes something a bit different out of it. And, you know, I think when you're so invested and so involved, it's so wonderful when other people give you a different insight.
Okay. Yeah, that's the only comments that we have at the moment. Thank you very much. That was very interesting.